Hello, everyone. It's Dr. Gage here. Let's get into week 2. And let me just fix myself up here. We're all good. Um, let's talk about your research projects. You guys are going to have to develop a research question. Oh my gosh, how do I do that? You might be asking yourself, on what kind of topic? How am I supposed to find it? What am I supposed to do? Okay, this is the first thing you should do. Think about a topic that you like, something that you love. We spoke about that last week. Second, use Google Scholar and then type in keywords that link to or relate it to what you might want to study. And find out and read those articles and determine what has been done before. And then you build off that. That is the first step to your project. But before we get into that more deeply, I want to share my screen with you. I kind of want to share my screen. Here we go. Where is it? Research methods. Is this the one I want? Yes. Okay. Let me try again. Share screen. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Okay. So use Google Google and ask yourself, because there's different types of studies. You can do a descriptive study, an exploratory study, an explanatory study, an evaluative study. Use Google to find out what kind of studies, like how to distinguish between the different studies that I just described. So, how often do Americans drink coffee? Use Google to try to find out to answer that question. Why do I tell you to use Google to do that? Because you're not going to find it in your chapter 1 or chapter 2, but you need to know it because it's going to help you figure out what kind of study you want to do. And then ask yourself, what is generalizability? That one I'll give to you because that one's just so important. You want to be able to generalize your results to the rest of the world when you're doing your work. So you design your study to make it generalizable. And so think of ways of how you can do that to make your study generalizable. There's ways. Google it and you'll find out. These are different types of validity. So which type of validity concerns if results are generalizable. So go find out. You can use your book to see the different types of validity to be able to answer that question. Okay. So let's get into it. Social research question. A question about the social world that is answered through the collection and analysis of firsthand verifiable empirical data. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to figure out a social research question that can be answered and verified. A good research question takes hard work because you really have to sharpen it and narrow it down. You don't want to do too much. It's not possible, especially not in this short period of time. So you have to evaluate possible research questions to find one that's worthwhile. So something that doesn't make everybody that is listening to it go to sleep. And the research question needs to be feasible, socially important, and scientifically relevant. That's what makes a good social research question. So as you consider your research questions for part 2 of this class, the part 2 part is doing your own research and presenting it, which we're going to be doing at that upcoming conference. Start consulting the literature. You do that by going to Google Scholar and a wealth of things will come up. The library also has a database for you to use, but you have a ton of scientific journals that are open and available to you. So your goal is to select a research question that builds on prior research. So I should not be able to go back and find a research study that has done it exactly how you have done it. It should be new and fresh and build to prior research. It should contain theory. What is theory? It's a logical, interrelated set of propositions about empirical reality. So theories help us make connections. A general social process and large bodies of research. So that's why theories are so important. So building and evaluating theory is one of the most important objectives of social science. So if you have theory related to, for example, gender inequality, and then you do your study on gender inequality, you can link. It helps you. You can link your data, and it helps you make connections. Deductive reasoning is the type of research in which specific expectation is deduced from a general premise and then is tested. So if you have an idea that living in a country where gender norms are very low or non-existent, so then you might see more women in the job force, in the workforce, could be your, you're operating outside of that theory. So then you want to go test that theory by seeing, is by looking to see how many women are in the job force, and is that true, and then does that have an impact on their health, for example. So with deductive research, you will start with a theory and then try to find data that will confirm or deny it. So that's how you do that. It's not in your book on page 21, that example. That's the prior textbook we used prior to this year. So a hypothesis, a tentative statement involving a relationship between two or more variables. A hypothesis does not just state that there is a connection between variables, it suggests that one variable influences the other. So that's that one variable influences the other. You hypothesize that smoking causes cancer, for example, or smoking influences your risk of getting cancer. So a variable we spoke about last week, very important in your research. It's a characteristic or property that can vary. So take on different variables or attributes in your survey that you will look at. For your research, all of the questions can be turned into a variable. So when you have a survey, any of those questions can be turned into a variable. You have your dependent variable, which I explained to you that you remember as your outcome variable, a variable that is hypothesized to vary depending or under the influence of another variable. And you have your independent variable, which is hypothesized to cause or lead to variation in another variable. So we spoke last week about DAGs, and I'll put up an example of that, of how I want you to be able to draw a simple DAG. So variables can take on different variable. This is the exact same thing, but in your survey that you use for part 2, you will make a dependent variable. So your outcome, so what you're looking for. So if you're going to research health, then health would be your variable. Or if you're going to look at smoking, then smoking would be your variable. Or car accidents, then car accidents would be your dependent variable. And your independent variable would be your educational level, age, employment status. Okay. Inductive reasoning, in contrast to deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning research begins with specific data, which are then used to develop a theory to account for that data. So if you're using data looking at inequality, for example, so then you can develop some theory based on the data, what you have. When you design a research study, you need to first ask yourself, how is the data collected? Because you mentioned that in your method section, you talk about it. If it's collected at one point in time, it's cross-sectional. A lot of large epidemiological studies are cross-sectional. So they will go to participants and ask them about different questions at one point in time. You also have longitudinal studies. Those studies are usually more expensive to carry out because you have to go and track these people, and you ask them questions at 2 points in time. So it's hard to keep track of people. People move, for example, especially depending upon the population. If you're looking at low income people, for example, they might move homes a lot. So much harder. So go and Google the World Health Survey, look at that survey, read about it, and try to understand and figure out, because it's going to be a test question, if it's cross-sectional or a longitudinal survey. So you also have trend designs, and that's when you look at studies over time. So with trends, for example, you can look at how has over time, how have the health of infant mortality, for example, over time. So in 1988, infant mortality was probably higher than in 1999. So you go and you look at that at different points in time, and you can get a trend. Panel designs, it's when this study in which data are collected from the same individual, so the panel at 2 or more points in time. A cohort is individuals or a group with a common starting point. So for example, all of the freshmen in 2016 are a cohort. So if we were look at all those freshmen in that cohort now in 2022, so 6 years later, to see what happened to you and what happened to them. Are they in graduate school? Do they have jobs? Did they drop out? That would be a cohort study design. So when you collect data at 2 or more points in time from individuals in a cohort, it's a cohort study design. Unit of analysis is spoken about in your book. Typically, a unit of analysis, it's related to the things, typically the people who you are studying, but it can also be groups, so families, governments, infant mortality rate, and sometimes levels are confused. So you look at you're at one level of analysis, and then you draw conclusions about another level of analysis, and you can't do that. You'll get an ecological fallacy. So if you are talking about a group level, so something that's happening on a group level, and then try to say that it's also happening on the individual level. You don't want to do that. You'll get an ecological fallacy. So an example is rich countries have higher rates of heart disease. Therefore, we would conclude that rich people have higher rates of heart disease. And so here, group level data, so the rich countries are used to draw conclusions that are inaccurate about the individual level. Rich people have higher rates of heart disease. So in rich countries, yes, there's more heart disease in America. Yes, absolutely. But actually heart disease is more prevalent in lower income people who are living in these rich countries. So the fallacy, so remember that when you're doing your research studies, if you're looking at group level data, then you can only make and draw conclusions on that group level. You cannot then go and assume on the individual level. And the fallacy also goes the other way around, called the reductionist fallacy, when incorrect conclusions about group level processes are based on individual level data. So keep that in mind as you draw your conclusions and as you work, and also for the exam. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So just to get into, so that goes a little bit deeper into chapter 1 and 2 than some of the keywords that were given in the book. You're introduced to cross-sectional studies, to longitudinal studies. I want you to go find out what the World Health Survey is and look into that. Know that in your survey, all of those questions can be turned into variables. Know that what a DAG is. I'm going to post something about DAGs where you can see what I'm talking about. And I just want you to be able to do a simple graph, knowing that your independent variable influences your dependent variable. So that's what that arrow means, that it influences. So you have to be very conscious about the arrow you draw. So smoking influences lung cancer rates, for example, is an example of that. And when you are thinking about your research question, like I said last week, do something that you're really interested in, because you're going to be married to this topic for the rest of the semester. So what I want you to do now is go to Google Scholar and start doing your lit review. Start looking to see what's already been done to start getting your brain going on what type of social science research question you want to answer, and make sure it builds on the literature. That's your goal for this week. So hopefully you can already get started with really sharpening and narrowing your research question, because that's how you start any research project. You first think about your question, and then you go to the literature and see how what you want to do fits into what's already been done. Alrighty, have a great day, and I wish you guys much success for the rest of this week. I'll see you next time. Bye.